Good morning, everyone. So far we have been talking about linear response only. So, in this last lecture, I'll discuss a bit how to go beyond linear response and what happens when perturbation strength is larger, so that linear response formula is not sufficient anymore to predict the response. So, we basically plan to go beyond the regime of Kuo formula or the non-equilibrium equivalent of it, and we are going to ask if there is any general structure like we saw for linear response case, that we can express the susceptibility in terms of correlations in the unperturbed state. So whether we can do the same for nonlinear response also, and we'll again use dynamical ensembles to go there. So let's first define what we mean by nonlinear response. So we have some observables. So as usual, we consider a perturbation starting at time t equal to 0, and we want to see the response of some observable O after time t, after time t, after the perturbation is switched on. So if we expand or write the second order term, so first, so OT minus O0 average unperturbed quantity. So first of all, we'll have epsilon chi1, which is the linear response, which we have been dealing with so far. And next, there will be some epsilon square, and the coefficient of that we define as the second order susceptibility or second order response. So this is nothing but the second derivative with respect to epsilon with a factor of half, evaluated at the unperturbed state. So the question is whether we can write it as a correlation in the unperturbed state itself. So it's particularly relevant around equilibrium, which we'll mostly consider here. So let's first take the static case. So we have started the perturbation at some time t equal to 0, and we are looking at the response after a very long time. So as before, we have some Hamiltonian H naught, which describes the equilibrium system in the absence of any perturbation. And then we add potential perturbation with some small strength, epsilon Vx, that's our perturbing term. And we ask how the expectation value of some observable O changes when the perturbed system reaches the new stationary state. So this again, we expect that the system goes to a new equilibrium state because, as long as exponential minus beta h is normalizable. And as we saw in our very first lecture, so the perturbed state is characterized by the configuration weights of this form, rho epsilon x, which is simply normalized exponential minus beta hx. So we can simply do a Taylor expansion in terms of epsilon and pick out the second order term, and that gives us this chi2. So we have a much more complicated expression compared to a linear response. We have four different terms, but the point to note here is that all of these terms are quadratic in the perturbing potential and linear in the observable that we are looking at. So this is just some expression we can, if we know the Hamiltonian and if we can perform the integrals, we can find this static response. Second question, more complicated question is, of course, if we can predict the time dependent response. So for that, we again take recourse to the dynamical ensembles. As before, we write the average of any arbitrary observable as a sum over all paths of observable value and multiplied with the probability of that path. And we again write in terms of an action with respect to some reference process. And again, we can simply take the second derivative and see that the second order response, chi2, is given by as a sum of two terms. One is the second derivative of the action, and another one is the first derivative square. Okay, so this is the formula. But we are not done yet. We want to see whether we can simplify it further, and what are the time reversal properties and what are the physical meanings of such second order response. Okay, so we use the decomposition in terms of frequency and entropy, as we write A equal to D minus half S, and here we add a crucial assumption, which is that the second derivative of S is 0. So entropy generated is linear in the perturbation strength. So in the examples that we saw over last 3-4 days, this is always true. That's what we saw. Entropy was always linear in the perturbation. And this is indeed true in most physical scenario. In some sense, this assumption defines the order of perturbation. So we are adding a term linear in epsilon to the Hamiltonian, And we are talking about what is the second order effect of that linear term in the observable. We are not adding an epsilon square term itself in the Hamiltonian. Then this assumption will not be true. Okay. So then so in this formula we can just put this S and D and put S double prime equal to 0. Then we are left with these 4 terms. So D double prime, S prime, and their various combinations. So let's see what happens if we are talking about around equilibrium. So then again, response of a state observable, that's our standard Kubo thing. So let's take an observable y, which is the difference of the initial value of the observable in the initial state and the final state. So oxt minus ox0. This by definition is antisymmetric under time reversal. And let's just write this formula for this particular observable y. So we have all these 4 terms. Now what we see is that 3 of these terms actually vanish because of just symmetry properties. So this first term, d double prime, since d is symmetric, all of its derivatives are also symmetric. So this is an average of an antisymmetric variable. Y is antisymmetric, d is symmetric. Similarly, the other 2 terms are also all symmetric. Here we have s prime square. Even though s prime is antisymmetric, s prime square is of course symmetric. So we are left with just one term, s prime d prime y. So it's very simple. And now if we write, yes? Yes. So now if we write y as oxt minus ox0, and in the second term, we again do the reversal check. So we the sum over all paths, we make it to sum over all reverse paths. That makes ox0 to oxt. So this gives, just gives a factor of 2. So we are left with chi2, which is half of this. It's given by simply minus s prime d prime oxt. So we here also we see it's a 3-point correlation. As we saw in the static case, we had v square o kind of terms. Here s prime d prime o. So 3-point correlation, that's a general structure, and we have a combination of excess entropy and excess dynamical activity. So now we can write the full nonlinear the fluctuation dissipation relation up to second order term. We have the usual first order term, which is excess entropy, and then this term. So one important thing is that in the second order term, it's only the linear excess which is appearing. So we only have s prime and d prime. We don't have d double prime appearing here, or at least state observable. And similarly for current by itself is antisymmetric. So we'll have this factor of half hanging about here. We can write the equivalent of Green-Kubo relation up to second order. So we have now derived a general formula for a second order response. So what is important here is that in linear response around equilibrium, we saw that it's totally thermodynamic. Any kind of kinetic details which were important for non-equilibrium response were totally invisible in equilibrium response. Here, once we go beyond the linear response regime and come to second order, then all these things actually play a role through this d prime term. And in that sense, there is no the second order response. It depends on the kinetic aspects. So for linear response, once we knew the protocol with which we were perturbing, we could predict the response. Here, that's not true anymore. So same, so 2 different perturbations which are thermodynamically equivalent or the same even, that would actually give rise to different second order response. So we'll see that in an example now. So let's take the example of boundary driven shape, which we saw on Wednesday. And so we have a symmetric exclusion process on a 1D lattice. The two boundaries are connected to 2 reservoirs of different chemical potential in general. Here we are talking about a perturbation around equilibrium. So our unperturbed system is the chemical potentials are equal. Unlike last day, we don't have any bulk drive anymore. We don't need that. We are talking about a response around equilibrium. So this is the sketch of the dynamics. At the left boundary, the one particle enters with rate alpha if the boundary site is empty, and if there is a particle, it leaves with rate kappa. And alpha over kappa is also, of course, related to the chemical potential through this relation. So alpha over kappa is exponential beta mu L. Similarly, at the right boundary, we have gamma and delta, which are related to the chemical potential of the right reservoir. And in equilibrium, of course, these chemical potentials are equal. I mean, in other words, when these chemical potentials are equal, we have an equilibrium situation. So let's introduce a perturbation which is changing the chemical potential of the left reservoir by a small amount, d mu L. And let's see what happens to the second order response. So we have to write the S omega and D omega as before. So S omega involves only jumps at the left boundary, and we have the same expression as we had yesterday. It's J in, so the net influx at the left boundary times beta mu L. So the excess entropy is simply beta times J in L, and this has to be evaluated at mu L equal to mu R, because we are doing around equilibrium. So what about the frenzy? So frenzy, we also derived a general expression which had the symmetric current, total number of transactions at the left boundary, and the residual time, dwelling times T0 and T1. So T0 and T1 were times. So T0 was the total time during which the first site was empty, and T1 was the total time during which the first site was filled. Plus, there are some mu L independent terms. We don't care about those because we are going to take a derivative with respect to mu L. So here what we see is that excess dynamical activity would of course depend on the specific form of alpha and kappa. Let's take two specific examples, two explicit forms. So first is that where alpha is simply exponential beta mu L by 2 and kappa is exponential minus beta mu L by 2. The ratio is exponential beta mu L as we want. There are no prefactors, so alpha kappa is 1. So in this case, the first term totally drops off because alpha kappa is 1, and d prime omega is simply this thing, beta over 2 alpha T0 minus kappa T1, again evaluated at mu L equal to mu R. Let's take another example where we just have alpha equal to exponential beta mu L and kappa equal to 1. Again, their ratio is same. So thermodynamically, these two rates are totally same, but kinetically they are different. And in this case, d prime is has completely different structures. We have the total number of jumps appearing here and only T0 appearing. Again, we have to take mu L equal to mu R. So if we are looking at response of some observable, let's say current through some bond or the density at some site, these two perturbations would give very different second order responses, even though they are totally identical thermodynamically and totally indistinguishable at the linear response level. In the second order response, they actually differ very much. And so that's something just to remember. The second order response is not thermodynamic even in equilibrium. So this form of okay, I'll take a pause. Is it clear what we did? So basically, I'll just summarize quickly. We derived a response formula going beyond the linear order. We kept the terms of the order of epsilon square, and we saw that around equilibrium, it's given by a very simple correlation, which is product of excess entropy and excess dynamical activity generated by the perturbation and correlated with the observable that we are looking at. So because of this, yes?
One question, I mean.
Yes.
So for the equilibrium case, I mean, this nonlinear response, I mean, similar to the Green-Kuba formula, was there an like in earlier studies?
Yes, I think there are some specific examples in optics. They often use this nonlinear response, and there, I mean, you can do as usual using the generator approach for specific systems, and then you can also show that these two are equivalent. But there, first of all, the expression is much more complicated because here you saw that because of the time symmetry, many of the terms just dropped off, and we are left with a very simple simple term. But there we cannot cancer sometimes just like that. So there existed a nonlinear response formalism, yes, for specific systems. No, as far as I know, no general no general understanding from at least time reversible perspectives, but there are for specific systems and using sometimes quantum formulation. So there is there are two papers by Alessandro Saracino where they also looked at second order response, and it turns out that their formula and ours are completely equivalent.
Okay.
There is and actually you can also, I mean, maybe I already said, so starting from generator formalism, you can show that we get the same thing, but it's a bit tedious. Yes, so this two different directions is, so this NL right is the net number of particles which entered the system up to time t, and NL left is the total number of particles which left the system through the first site. And this n here is just the sum of these two. So total number of particles exchanged at the left boundary. Is it clear now? Okay.
Ma'am,
yes.
Can you explain again why S double prime has to be 0? I mean, you chose it to be 0.
Yes. So in all the examples that we saw so far, it always turned out that S was simply linear in epsilon, right? In the perturbation strain. So this is related to the fact that we are always talking about perturbations which is like adding a linear term with Hamiltonian, or adding a linear force. I mean force linear in epsilon. The potential can be anything, but the prefactor is just epsilon. So we are not adding any epsilon square term in the perturbation itself.
Yeah.
So we could have thought about, so let's say we are taking a perturbation which is h equal to h naught plus epsilon h1 plus epsilon square h2.
Okay.
Then this assumption would not be true.
Okay. Okay.
Right? Yeah. So dimensionally, you can also think, so just the term we are adding, that is giving rise to, it's the same dimension as energy, and so beta times this is entropy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
So that's basically defining our order of perturbation. This assumption is defining our order of perturbation.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
I have a question, small question. This,
Yes.
what do you mean by this thermodynamically identical? Here, it's like, I mean, a change in the chemical potential.
Yes.
In the two cases you showed. I mean, what would be some other examples, like in other systems, like the temperature gradient is different, something like this?
Yes. Temperature gradient, potential, anything. I mean, just thermodynamic variables are changing.
Okay.
Or just free energy, these kind of things. Okay.
Another question. When we have two different choice of alpha and k, kappa, then I mean, which one would we actually notice in experiment if an experiment is performed in
So that is the point. That actually depends totally on, in the experiment, in that particular experiment that we are doing, how we are coupling the system to the reservoir. That could be different from system to system, right? Or even think about one colloidal particle moving in some medium, given some temperature. So the particle has some friction, and so the medium has some viscosity, right? So we are if we are looking at the same particle in water or in oil, in linear order we would not see any difference, because all we see is the effect of temperature.
Okay.
But in second order we'll actually see difference.
Okay. So just another maybe slightly side question. In principle, if we had overdamped equation and we started with, let's say, gamma as our friction, and then we did a small difference, like different gamma, let's say gamma prime, slightly close to gamma only. I mean, can we use this approach to talk about the behavior of the system?
Yes, so that is one of the open questions. So it seems from here that we should be able to distinguish between between two medium, or I mean two systems which are kinematically different from looking at the second order response. So so this second order response formula actually has been experimentally verified with a single colloidal particle in a given medium. We did not change the medium there, but in principle, yes, then it should be doable. So that actually gives it's a very good question. So it actually gives rise to a possibility that we can distinguish between systems which are not distinguishable at the linear order, but only at the second order.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. So yes. So this structure, we saw that the second order response only has linear excesses, so S prime and D prime only. So this gives rise to a possibility of an extrapolation scheme. So suppose for a system we could measure S prime and D prime directly, okay, by performing an experiment in equilibrium and an experiment close to equilibrium. So from there, suppose we could determine S prime and D prime directly, and then we would be able to predict response far away from equilibrium, I mean within the second order regime. So this is like an extrapolation. So we have our experiment is only restricted to equilibrium and near equilibrium, and from that we are able to predict second order response. But there is a caveat that would require knowledge about all possible paths, because we have to do an average over all possible paths, S prime, D prime, average over all possible paths with the observable. And in principle, I mean in practical sense, in practice for a complex system, this would be impossible because the path number would be infinitely many. But if it so happens that there is a coarse grained picture, or we are interested in only some macroscopic observables which has just a finite number of values or finite number of paths, then we should be able to do this extrapolation, and it could be even useful. For example, in some experiment, it could happen that we have access to very limited number of degrees, and we don't even know the underlying dynamics. Let's say, suppose we have one particle moving in a viscoelastic medium. So I'll talk about it later again. So we don't even know how exactly to write the dynamics. So we don't know the Langevin equation, and so how do we go about looking for response? So one way is to do two experiments in the equilibrium and close to equilibrium, and then go just extrapolate the result. Okay. So for that, we'll need a coarse-grained perturbation theory, because as I said, this S prime D prime in full microscopic details, that's very hard. That's practically impossible. But let's see what happens if we go for a coarse-grained picture. So suppose we have a complex system and we map it to some coarse-grained macroscopic states, capital X, which we just denote as 0 to n-1. So there are n possible macroscopic states. One example is here. Suppose we have one particle moving in a double well potential, and suppose for some reason it suffices to know whether the particle is in the left well or right well. Okay, suppose we only have access to that information, and that's enough. So then we have a coarse-grained picture where my macroscopic variable x has two values, 0 and 1, depending on in which well the particle is. And so this is the coarse-grained picture. Another example would be, let's say we take a classical Ising model, and my coarse-grained variable is whether the magnetization is positive or negative. I don't look at all the configuration of the full system. I just can measure the total magnetization, and if it is positive, I call my x1, and if it is negative, I call my x0. So these are two typical examples. That doesn't sound so unreasonable. It could easily, it could easily occur. So that's how we are defining a macroscopic state or coarse graining. So remember that here we are not making any assumption on the dynamics of the microscopic variables. We are just taking a set of microscopic states and assigning a value of macroscopic variable x to them. So is it clear what I said? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so now let's define paths in this macro space. So we have paths. So the paths will be determined by or characterized by the initial value of capital X and the final value. So we have probability Pij, which is the probability that my microscopic state started at, my microscopic trajectory started in a state which belonged to the macroscopic value I, and it ended in a state which belonged to the macroscopic value j. So if we have, let's say we have n equal to 2, like in our the double well case. So the paths are: the particle starts from the left well, ends up at the right well, starts from the left well, it stays in the left well, starts from the right well, ends up in the left well, and it starts in the right well and stays in the right well throughout. So this is, there are only 4 possible paths. Remember that we are not talking about what happens in the meantime. It could have crossed, etc. That's fine. We are only talking about the endpoints. So the initial configuration and the final configuration, that is characterizing my path. So now we have just finitely many paths depending on the value of n. So I'll mostly talk about n equal to 2 because that's the simplest case we can have. So now what is this path probability Pij? So this is simply sum over all microscopic paths which start in I and end in j. So this is my notation, integral d omega, p omega, the small p I will use now to denote microscopic path widths. So sum over all those paths which started in I and ended in j. So this is my macroscopic path probability. It retains the equilibrium property that these paths will be reversible in even in the macroscopic description. So Pij t, the reverse path is simply Pji. So P equilibrium Ij t is equal to Pji equilibrium t. Now we can again define an action. So we'll follow the exactly the same procedure as we are doing for the microscopic states, and we'll define an action. And for simplicity, we will take the reference process as the equilibrium, as the unperturbed process itself. So we have Aij simply given by log of Pij by Pij equilibrium, and this we can write in terms of the microscopic things. It will not be necessary, but just to see the structure. So this small a is the microscopic action, and we write it as an integral over all those paths starting in I and ending in j. As before, we can define our entropy and frenzy in coarse-grained path space. So Dij is equal to Dji, and Sij is equal to minus Sji. So this is antisymmetric, this is symmetric. But we the great benefit is that we just have a finite number of these quantities. These are simply yes, yes.
So this, if you go back, so this small p of omega basically also includes the initial
yes, yes.
Distribution, which is conditioned on the microscopic configuration in being in the macro state I.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So let's look at the observable of some coarse-grained, function of this coarse-grained observable x. So we have some oxt, and we can, so the average of this observable O is simply sum over Pij Oj. We are talking about a state observable at the final time. So Pij Oj, all possible Ij. And we can do the standard expansion in the macroscopic language, and we end up with 2 terms in the second order. We have our S prime D prime term as we had before, and now we have a S double prime term, because S double prime was 0 in the macroscopic sense. So S double prime, there is no reason why S double prime should be 0 in the macroscopic picture also. In fact, it turns out that it's not 0 in general. So once we write it explicitly, we have expressions for S prime, D prime, and S double prime in terms of microscopic path widths and microscopic excess entropy and dynamical activity. And this is S double prime, which you don't have to remember this expression, just to remember that it is not 0 in general. But now let's restrict ourselves to the cases where the perturbation is in the macrospace itself. So the perturbation, let's say, for one example, is a potential which acts on the capital X space only. In the double well case, it could be that a constant force acts on the right side of the on the right well, and a constant force with a different value acts on the left side. So this is a perturbation which acts only on the macroscopic observable. So in that case, we can show that this S double prime actually vanishes. It's also stands to reason because now we have a perturbation in X space, capital X space only. So all the physical conditions which were there in the microscopic space is also there now. So we don't have any second order change in the entropy. And then we have a response formula which is exactly identical to the microscopic structure, but with the added benefit that the sum now is just over some discrete paths. In particular, let's say we have n equal to 1 and our observable is x itself. So then what will contribute from this term is that OJ would be contributing only when j equal to 1. And then we must have final state equal to 1, all the other terms drop off. And then the 1, 1 term, so all the paths starting in 1 and ending in 1, for them S prime 1, 1 is 0 because of the antisymmetry. So we just have this term S prime 0, 1, D prime 0, 1 and P equilibrium 0, 1. So we just have to measure 3 scalar quantities and then we are done. We can predict the response of this kind of observable. Okay, so now we have our extrapolation scheme. We are ready to talk about it. So what we do is that we measure the macroscopic path probabilities in equilibrium and near equilibrium within the linear regime. And from these two, we extract our excess entropy and excess dynamical activity. So remember that we don't need to know anything about the dynamics. We are just observing some degree of freedom, let's say a particle position or the total magnetization of Ising model, and we are just looking at how many times among some large times, how many times the particle or my system starts from state I and ends up at state j given some time duration t. All we are doing is measuring this number of certain trajectories over the total number of trajectories. That would give us our path probability. We don't need to know about the dynamics, and from that we can extract S prime and D prime. S prime in fact doesn't even require the equilibrium path probabilities, simply Pij over Pji, because you remember S prime S is antisymmetric, so this is the antisymmetric part of the path probability. D prime requires equilibrium also. So we need to perform two experiments, one in equilibrium, one close to equilibrium, and then we can use these results to predict response far away from equilibrium. And the cost that we are paying for not knowing the system details is that we have to perform an extra experiment which is close to equilibrium. Okay, and the assumption we are making is that the perturbation is in the macroscopic variable. Is it clear what we are doing here, at least what the strategy is? Okay, so let's take some example.
Can you repeat it, Rob?
Yes. So what we are doing now, so we had a second order response formula and we saw a potential of an extrapolation scheme from there because it only had first linear changes, S prime and D prime. So from there, we devised a scheme to measure S prime and D prime in the case where there are only finitely many paths. So we are talking about an coarse-grained picture. We have only finite number of paths depending on the value of my coarse-grained observables. And what we do there is we measure so given some dynamics, the system is evolving following its own microscopic dynamics, and we are observing the macroscopic variable only. So for example, in the double well case, we are observing only whether the particle is in the left well or right well. And we are observing, let's say, for an interval of time t and many times. Let's say 100 times we observe such trajectories, and among these 100, 20 times the particle started from left well and ended up in the right well. So the probability of such a path, so P01 I'll call it, starting from 0 ending in 1. So probability of such a path is simply 20 by 100 given my time interval. Okay. Is it clear how I define the path probability?
Yeah.
Okay, and once we have these path probabilities for all paths, so 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, all these 4 paths, once I have all these quantities, I can immediately extract S prime and D prime using this formula. Yeah. So S prime would be P01 divided by P10. So S prime 01, which is equal to minus S prime 10, and D prime 01 would be some other function. So we have to multiply P01 with P10 and take its difference with the equilibrium probability. equilibrium path probability. So what we are doing now is that we are performing two experiments. We are performing these probabilities, path probabilities in equilibrium, no bias, nothing. And then we are adding a small bias and checking how these probabilities are changing with this bias. And from these two experimental data, equilibrium and near equilibrium, we extract our linear axis in capital S and capital D. And that we will use to predict the observable, the change in the observable, the response, the second order response. Okay,
Yeah.
Is it clear?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a specific example where we can actually work out everything. So let's take a 4-state jump process. So the system can be in any of the 4 states. I'll call it A, B, C, and D. And this is showing the jump rates. So from A, it can go to B, and from B, it can come back to A, and from C to D and D to C, and B and C are also connected with a bond. So just a linear kind of structure. You can think of it as a lattice on with 4 sides. And so now I identify my macroscopic states. So A and B, I identify as x equal to 0. So if the system is in A or in B, I'll call that it is in a macroscopic state x equal to 0. And similarly, if it is in C or D, I'll call it capital X equal to 1. And what is my perturbation? So my perturbation, remember we assume that the perturbation couples to X only. So we bias this bond between B and C, which is essentially the bond connecting the two X values. So we bias it with some field epsilon. So this is exponential epsilon. That's my bias. And it's a very toy example just to see that this formalism actually works. So our observable is also simply the X, and we write the change in the observable as up to second order, I mean epsilon chi1 and epsilon chi2. And in this case, it's just a 4-state jump process. So we can actually solve the time-dependent Markov, master equation in the perturbed and unperturbed cases both. So from there, we can, so once we solve it in the perturbed case, we can find the X average in the perturbed scenario. We can explicitly calculate it as a function of epsilon. And from there, we can extract the second order response simply by taking second derivative with respect to epsilon. So that I'll call my chi2 perturbed. Okay, that is one thing we have at hand. From the perturbed system itself, we have extracted the second order response. On the other hand, we have a prediction, which is that this response should be equal to minus S prime D prime P equilibrium. So all these quantities, again, we can find out from the unperturbed solution of the master equations, because here we can solve the full time dependent master equations. So we know the full propagators. What is the probability that starting from B, the system ends up in C? What is the probability that starting from A, it ends up in C? So adding all those microscopic paths, so a macroscopic path 0 to 1 would be sum over A to C, B to C, A to D, B to D, this kind of things. And then from there we can extract our S prime D prime, and it turns out that they are identical. It's exactly same. It has to be. I mean, there is no assumption there as such. So here, the expressions are messy, so I did not show the expressions, but this is just a plot. So we have this, we have plotted this chi2 as a function of t. So this blue curve is actually two different curves. One is chi2 perturbed and one is the chi2 predicted. So another point I want to make here is that unlike the usual coarse graining procedure, where it is often assumed that the microscopic degrees which we are coarse graining are much faster. Yes, Ayan?
Yes. So how do you measure chi2 again?
So we do two things. One is we actually can solve the full perturbed system with the rate e to the power epsilon, and from there we can find X average in presence of epsilon. Okay, so we have an expression X average as a function of epsilon. We simply take the second derivative. So that is my directly measured second order response. Okay. On the other hand, yes.
No. Okay, go on.
Yeah, on the other hand, we can also use our prediction formula, which does not require putting in epsilon in the rate. We just have the equilibrium system, and from there we can construct this S prime and D prime.
Yeah. Okay. That's okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I mean, this is this is not entirely true. What I said, for S prime and D prime, we of course need a small perturbation. So we do with a small epsilon, just take up to linear order, and from there we extract this S prime and D prime, and that we multiply with P equilibrium. That gives our predicted chi2. Okay.
So with the small epsilon also it's equilibrium state, right?
No, it's not equilibrium, but we are doing two experiments, one in equilibrium. So we need the path weights in equilibrium, and we need the path weights close to equilibrium, and the difference would give us the excess entropy and excess dynamical activity. But the point is that we are predicting the second order response. So this chi2 that we predict would actually give our response for a much larger value of epsilon. So if we extract this S prime and D prime with, let's say, epsilon equal to 0.01, and we can actually predict the response for epsilon even an order larger, so, epsilon 0.1 or even larger. In this case, actually, it's even larger.
Okay, but I mean, when you put a small epsilon, I mean, if you look at the exact system, it's I mean, the steady state doesn't satisfy detailed balance.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. So that's the price we paid. It's not in terms of we cannot just predict this from equilibrium anymore. We need a small epsilon. Yes. But the average is with respect to equilibrium. It's only we need this small epsilon to calculate S prime and D prime.
Right. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So if you look here, so this was our expression. So S prime, D prime, P equilibrium. So this is an average in equilibrium, all right. But here we are. So this S prime and D prime we don't know in terms of dynamical quantities as we did in microscopic case. Here all we know is the path weights, and to find S prime, D prime we actually have to take the derivative itself. So that's what we are doing. We are doing an experiment just close to equilibrium and taking the difference. So this is the derivative, and we have to multiply this by equilibrium path weight. Is it?
Yeah. Okay. There are some questions in the
Yes.
chat.
So to Aniket's question, I'm coming to that later. What do you mean by in general is not very clear yet, but I'll come to it. So Shayani is asking if D state is connected to the A state, same as B and C. If D is connected to A, no, because then this perturbation. So our assumption for the exact result was that the perturbation is acting only on the X variable. So in that case, that would not be true, because the X variable would then so A to D connection would also be a connection between these two X states, and then it would not be true. Not be true exactly, but we will see other examples where it's still a very good approximation. Okay, Aniket, can you specify what do you mean by in general? So under the assumption that the perturbation, okay, so I'll just repeat Shayani's answer. So what we are doing here, we assume in the formalism that the perturbation is affecting or perturbation is coupling to the capital S variable only. Okay. So here we have done that with only changing one rate from B to C. If we actually do it also from D to A, I don't think in general it would work, but we can probably make some particular choice of rates where it works. Because then you will be adding two channels to go between x equal to 0 and x equal to 1. So then we have to, yes. And then we have to actually make sure that this is in the form of only coupling capital X. This is not, this will not be in general true. Okay. In all the systems, yes. So Aniket, so what do you mean in all the systems? So as long as we have this assumption that the perturbation is in the capital X space, then yes, it is true. So we are doing a mathematical expansion on the left hand side, and we have obtained our right hand side simply from that mathematical expansion. So if we are within the assumption, then it is true for all the systems. But this assumption is rather a stringent one, that the perturbation is only in the capital X space. We will see that it is a good approximation even when the prediction is quite a good prediction even when this assumption breaks down a bit. Okay, this we'll see in a moment. So here I just want to point out one more thing. One thing is that so unlike usual coarse graining, we have not assumed any time scale separation within a microscopic scale. So here, if you look at the Chi2, actually it has two different time scales. One scale is very short; it's this decay, and then we have a very slow decay. So the rates were chosen in a way so that we have these two time scales. In particular, if we look at rho A and rho B, probability that the particle is in the microscopic states A and B, those two actually decay with very different time constants. So one is very fast, the other one is very small for some choice of R, etc. And yet the formalism is working perfectly. So it does not depend on any assumption of time scale separation. Okay. Okay. Now we take a more complicated example. We take near critical Ising model, and here we add a perturbation which is not in the form of capital X. So we add a magnetic field in all the spins. So we have our usual Ising Hamiltonian SIST, sum over nearest neighbors, plus some base magnetic field H. This we have put because if this is if this is 0, then the second order response would actually be 0. So this is some base value H, and then on top of that we are adding epsilon sum over SI. So this again you see so my coarse grained observable is theta of magnetization. So if the total magnetization is positive, I'll call it x equal to 1. If the total magnetization is negative, I'll call x equal to 0. And clearly this perturbation is not in x. We cannot write it as a function of x only. But let's still apply this formalism. We measure the path weights in the coarse grained picture. So we see how many times the total magnetization of the system flips on a lattice. So this has to be done by simulation. There is no exact calculation anymore. And we measure all the path weights, and we measure them with epsilon equal to 0 and a very small value of epsilon, which is 10 to the power minus 4. And we calculate the predicted Chi2, which is S prime D prime X, and times P equilibrium. And then we also extract the second order response with a larger perturbation. So with one order larger epsilon 0.003, we extract the Chi2 in the large perturbation system, and we compare these two. Okay, so here there are many curves. So one of them, this blue one, is the perturbed one, and the red one is n equal to 2. I mean our two-state picture, the predicted value of Chi2 from the two-state picture, and they match quite well. And what we can do, we can even do better. We can actually now increase the resolution in some sense. So we now coarse grain, not with magnetization just positive and negative, but with a finer value, finer value of resolution. So we have more than two states, let's say 4 or 6, but still much smaller compared to the full microscopic space. And what we see is that the formula converges better and better as we increase n. And in fact, by n equal to 6, it's almost perfect with the directly measured quantity. So even in the cases where the perturbation is not exactly in the form which our mathematical derivation assumed, even then it works pretty well. So we also have other examples. This I have not shown here, but we can actually calculate in some cases. For example, a single particle in a harmonic potential. and with a linear potential as perturbation, we can explicitly again calculate everything and see that the formalism works quite well if we increase the resolution. So is it clear what I said? So I'm basically done. I'll just conclude with some remarks. So let's take some question here already.
So in this case, this perturbation is not in X space, but I mean, so in principle, it won't be exact, right?
No, it is not exact. In principle, it's not exact. But on the other hand, numerically, it's quite good.
Okay.
Yeah, and the point is that as we increase the resolution of our, I mean, this macroscopic coarse graining, as we increase the resolution, it becomes better and better, and it converges quite fast. So here, if you see this dashed line, this is the static response which we can exactly calculate. So this is what this curve should saturate to for, I mean, in the exact case, with this larger value of epsilon, and you see that within n equal to 6, it's almost there. So here, of course, why this works? So we don't exactly know, but one reason could be that within one state, within one macroscopic state, there is sort of fast convergence. I mean, the usual coarse graining assumption also holds here. So what happens for Ising model? So we are talking about almost, I mean, quite close to criticality. What happens then is that the local magnetization changes fast, but the global magnetization flips on a much slower scale. So to go from M positive to M negative, that's a much slow process, which involves our coarse grain picture. So it's flipping from 0 to 1, or negative magnetization to positive magnetization, whereas flipping a single spin is much faster. So it could be that this fast relaxation within one macroscopic state is what is guaranteeing the working of this formula in this case. It also holds for even double well, I mean, quite perfectly. Even though we know mathematically it's not exact, but in practice it works. So this is particularly useful in the context of experiments. Often doing experiments with large perturbation and getting enough statistics to predict anything is much harder in many kinds of experiments. So here, what we can do is that, and moreover, to have a theoretical prediction for systems for which we don't know the dynamics. So here, yes, I'll come to that. So here, we don't need the dynamics. So that's the great benefit. Once we are in a finite path space, we just have to observe the paths, and then we can predict this response. We don't need to know. Like as I said in the beginning, if a particle is moving in a viscoelastic medium, then we don't know how to even model or how to even theoretically predict, even though we have this dynamical ensemble formalism, but that requires the dynamics to be known. Then only we can have a theoretical prediction. Or even for Kubo formula, we need to know, to actually compute, we need to know how the system evolves. So here we don't need that. We just need some numbers, some finite numbers, 2 or 4 or 6. Is this susceptibility saturating to the static value in a power law in it? Yes. What is the power? We don't know. But so here, so this is the plot. Sorry, no, Shiny, I'm sorry. No, this was rather an exponential. So if this is a plot of chi2 minus chi2 static, it's in a Sobolev scale, and it is exponentially saturating. Okay. Yes, so this formalism we can easily apply for complex systems, in particular where we have access to only few degrees of freedom. And one example is colloid moving in viscoelastic medium, which is very relevant in many experimental scenarios. Okay, so I am done. So if where is yeah, if there are any questions from today or the days before, we can take it now.
I have one question regarding the linear response theory.
Okay.
And yeah, okay. Shall we go to the page 8?
Which page? 8 today's lecture? Or?
Yeah, today.
Page 8. Yes.
So the second order term, if we just have a look at it, where the current induced by the second order term does not depend on the sign of epsilon, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if we consider the example we treated, which is the system with different chemical potential at the end, no matter whether I'm lowering or increasing the chemical potential, this term will induce the current of same direction.
Yes.
So does this actually imply some sort of convergence range of this series expansion above epsilon? Because where if we have some situation like I lowered the chemical potential in one end and particles are actually flowing from that end to the other, then it'll be very strange.
Sorry, can you repeat? So you are doing what? So you are lowering in one end and increasing in the other end.
No. So the current induced by the second order term does not depend on the sign of the epsilon.
Yes.
So let's suppose this term is given in the way that if I modulate the chemical potential on the left, then the current induced by the second order term is flowing toward the right. Let's suppose that. So no matter whether I'm actually increasing the chemical potential or lowering the chemical potential.
Okay.
So in that case, where if I decrease the chemical potential of the left end enough, then because of the second lower that enough so that the second term wins over the first term, then
okay.
we may expect, yeah.
So this physically will not happen. So if you are, because here we have restricted only to epsilon square term, right? But now you are talking about terms even higher order because you are increasing your epsilon even further. So there will be other terms coming from epsilon cube, etc. Right? So yes. So that the entire series will make sure that this unphysical thing doesn't happen. So that indeed would give a restriction or constraint on how far we can actually apply this nonlinear response theory. Yes. So that was your initial question, right? If it gives any constraint on the regime.
Yeah. So can you actually extract some information about the convergence range of this series expansion? Convergence range in terms of epsilon at this level, or?
So that depends on the system, right?
Yeah.
That depends on the system. So for a specific system, so let's say, so formally we can even write the third order term.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, sure.
Yes, we can even write the third order term. So the convergence or the validation regime would be when the third order term is still negligible, and we, just comparing the magnitude of the first two terms and the third order term, and then only when that is large enough, then only we can use this approximation. Yes, but that would totally depend on the specific system, because that would depend on the value of this and the observable also, of course. So that would depend on this correlation. So this correlation and the correlations appearing in the third order term, that would give this this particular thing. And in some cases, actually, so okay. So first thing is that, so whether we can see epsilon square term or not, right? Because epsilon term is actually dominating often. So
when epsilon is small, yes.
When epsilon is small, yes. So we have to actually find, I mean, it is acting in an intermediate regime when epsilon is large enough, but not so large that actually higher order terms contribute. And actually in experiments or in the simulations, what we did was to eliminate all odd order terms. So because of some symmetry, if we reverse the sign of epsilon, then the odd order terms drop off. And then we can see the second order term much more clearly, because fourth order is farther away.
Oh, in that case, the response of the system wouldn't depend on which direction I'm modulating the system, right?
If it so happens, so that depends on. So for example, so there is not often a direction sense, right? So if there is a force, then this argument, I mean, there is a left-right symmetry, and then this would be true. On the other hand, for example, for Ising model, I mentioned that if we do not have any H naught, then the second order response itself is 0. We only have so that, I mean, this kind of properties would depend on the specific system and what kind of perturbations we are applying, whether there is any symmetry in that perturbation. Okay. So.
Okay. So in that case, there should be some constraint introduced by the second law, because I mean, current is somehow associated with the.
So what so I'm not sure about what you mean by constraint. So whatever we write, whatever response theory we arrive at, that should of course be consistent with the second law.
Yes.
And if we are doing everything mathematically correct, we should not find ourselves in a situation where we are violating second law. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
But yes.
Mm-hmm. So no, I mean, in the simulation, of course, I mean, if supposing you can make epsilon quite large and look at the response, and there, of course, you'll find it's always positive. And so if you plot the up to second order this expression, then you'll find that this, of course, changes sign somewhere. But so at small epsilon till some region there's agreement, and after that they will diverge, right?
So what are we plotting? We are plotting the
J. Let's say the response J as a function of epsilon.
Okay.
So till some epsilon they will match perfectly.
Yes.
And then they'll start deviating. So one of them should, of course, always be positive. The actual exact thing shouldn't change sign.
Around equilibrium.
Yeah. No, I'm saying if you do like if you compute J epsilon exactly from the simulation.
Yes.
And just plot it as a function of epsilon, then of course you can access the highly non-linear regime also.
Yes.
And there you should see a big difference between this second order expansion and the exact.
Yes.
So the exact thing will always, of course, be positive, but this one will change sign at some point.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
But I guess it's difficult to say at where till what value of epsilon it's.
Yeah, that depends very much on the particular observable and the system. So for one particular, I mean, one given system, we can maybe do some estimate. Or not even. I'm not sure if we can do without knowing the dynamics. But I mean, formally, what we can do is that we can put some restriction in the put an estimate in the sense that we can compute the third order, and if we just say that that the third order is small enough, or third order is smaller than the first order and second order term. So that would give us a regime of epsilon, right?
Right. Yeah, that should give some.
Some estimate in terms of all these correlations.
Yeah.
So Ion is asking, the second order response does look like a first order response of some other observable. Like yes, that is correct. That is correct, Ion. Okay. And there are limitations. Are there limitations to non-equilibrium response theory? Non-equilibrium response theory. So this approach, this dynamical ensemble approach, of course, has some limitations. Like yesterday also we were discussing. if we do not have absolute continuity between the unperturbed and the perturbed process, then we cannot apply this formalism. And there are several examples. One simple case is where you have an extended system, let's say chain of oscillators connected to two thermal baths at the two end, and there are no other noise in the bulk of the system, and we add a mechanical perturbation in the bulk. Then also we don't have this absolute continuity. Then it doesn't work formally. But sometimes one can apply some limiting procedures, but that also depends on the specific scenario. Okay, general question: does the dynamical activity term has to do something with the activity we put in simulations by hand in the dynamics? I don't know who it is. Galaxion 7. What do you mean by the activity we put in simulations by hand? Do you mean for active particles? This is, I mean, this, do not confuse this activity with that activity. Okay, so even for an active system, as we saw in RTP example yesterday, even for an active system, we can of course define dynamical activity, but those two are not exactly same. And moreover, dynamical activity in itself is not a non-equilibrium concept. It's only that for response theory, this appears only when we go beyond linear response in equilibrium. But dynamical activity in the sense of just total number of jumps or time symmetric currents, etc., they are also there in equilibrium. In fact, what happens in equilibrium is that as we go close to equilibrium, the currents sort of lose direction, and we saw this also in a mathematical form on Wednesday maybe, that we saw that the two terms, when we are talking about response of a state observable, the two terms actually become equal, and that gives rise to the Kubo formula. So in some sense, the currents sort of lose direction as we go close to equilibrium, and that adds up to give only the entropy term. Because entropy and dynamical activity are not independent quantities, right? We saw that they have to satisfy certain restrictions. In the sense, the average excess dynamical activity, doesn't matter which way we perturb, has to be equal to average excess entropy, and so on and so forth. So they are not completely independent. Dynamical activity is also there in equilibrium. It's just that in equilibrium it suffices to talk about entropy only, and we don't need to speak about it explicitly. But if we want to measure quantities which are in that sense dynamical activity, nothing to do with activity as in active particles, nothing to do with source of non-equilibrium, but just an ordinary random walker moving in equilibrium. If we want to ask questions like how many jumps it makes, or even quantities like what is the time a Brownian particle spends below a certain level. So these are also quantities which are symmetric under time reversal, right? Yeah. So that's, I mean, for these cases, even in equilibrium, we'll have to take care of this term. Okay.
There was one old question from Sayan.
Is this as well, I mean, this we did in simulation, we did it on a very small lattice. The temperature was higher than criticality. So even though, we see some effect of criticality, but not really, not in the saturation of the response. Okay. Okay. Oh, Orko has a question. Static second order response in equilibrium, third or fourth slide. Can be calculated from equilibrium, right? Do we get the same result from dynamical ensemble approach, which requires S prime and D prime and details? Yes, of course we must. must get the same result. But to show that is requires some pages of algebra. As we saw also in equilibrium, right? We got the same. I don't remember if we explicitly saw that, but similar to equilibrium, yes. We similar to linear response, yes. We get the same.
Oh, no, I had one question. So this, if you use this fluctuation relations, then in general you can, for example, derive the Green-Kubo but also higher order response relations.
Yes.
Right, and so does that? I mean, how does that compare with this results?
I think they are equivalent because fluctuation relations are also talking about pathways. So using this dynamical ensemble formalism, fluctuation relations are very easy to derive. Just 2 lines.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So what you get from the fluctuation relations for A should be identical.
It should be identical once we identify the S prime, D prime, etc. Once we identify, because it's the same formalism, right?
Right,
In
yeah.
the fluctuation, Crookes relation, it just says that the probability of forward path divided by backward path is just the entropy. So this is what we had. I mean, our this formalism is completely equivalent to that, and we can actually derive all these fluctuation theorems. So detailed fluctuation theorem, the Crookes one, and the steady state fluctuation theorem. All of them can be derived quite simply from the dynamical ensembles.
Okay. The other question I had was like when you write this for the macro coarse grained variables, you define this transition probabilities, right?
Yes,
PI.
yes.
But I guess one can't really define a Markov process to.
No.
It's not. It doesn't define a.
No.
Right, okay.
So this is not really a Markov process, and these trajectories are also. I mean, in between it could have gone to the other state and come back, etc. So in the macro space, it's not really Markov, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
So all these viscoelastic medium dynamics, they are not Markov, right? They have memory, and that's why we do not know how to write the equation even. And
right, yeah.
So we were actually thinking of really directly doing this experiment, so it stopped at some point. But one can do so, like one colloid in a medium of with polymers, etc., which makes the medium have many different time scales, and it works fairly well.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
I guess not. So I'll just end with just a brief summary of what we did and what we didn't. So we did linear response around equilibrium, and we saw how to extend that for non-equilibrium systems. And we developed a formalism called dynamical ensembles. And we saw how to physically interpret the non-equilibrium response formalisms. And today we did a nonlinear response even. So the questions I did not touch is what happens if we want to do thermal response. So if we have 2 thermal baths and we want to increase one temperature of 1 bath, or if we have just 1 particle in a thermal bath and we want to increase the temperature. So the same formalism works, but there are some additional nuances because temperature appears in the, temperature is directly related to the noise with which we are doing this path probability. Another question is non-equilibrium baths. We did not touch at all. That's a very open field. Not much are known there even. And time-dependent rates for jump processes. For there also one can do some things formally. But these are the questions we did not touch. But if anyone is interested, you can always look up and. So this non-equilibrium baths and response for active matter, these are very open fields for people who are interested. And there are many interesting questions there. So I guess we just end. Thanks to all for listening, and thanks again to Abhishek and Sandeep for giving me this opportunity to speak here.